So taking today to do some R&D, had a bit of inspiration. So one of the issues we've been running into making these Jukes higher power is the limitation of the mass airflow system and the tuning capabilities. So we have two tuning options for the factory computer, and that is we have UpRev and we have Accutech. Now, Accutech is a much more in-depth software, but there's still built-in limitations because of how the Juke ECU works. One of those limitations is the way that it calculates torque. It eventually hits a limit where it can no longer calculate torque. And it calculates torque based off of mass airflow readings. And once you get to a certain torque level, this is UpRev, but it's the same concept. You can enter in as big of a number as you want here, and it just doesn't recognize it, and it'll actually start closing the throttle because it thinks you're making too much torque, so it wants to pull the torque back. So we will typically use UpRev for the higher horsepower cars because we can just shut off the electronic throttle control, which is this right here. Now, that's all fine and good, but we still run into a problem with mass airflow. Now, UpRev, we cannot scale the MAF and map sensors in the software. There are no adjustments for that. We have a mass airflow percentage thing here, which you can play around with, and you can get the car to run and drive fine on an upgraded MAF. That's not a big deal, and it even has the ability to run the UpRev GT MAF, which is fine, but we have found that on the factory intake tube, that once you get to about, and we're going to go on horsepower numbers here because it's easier for people to understand. Once you get to about 400-ish horsepower, even that is starting to max out because of how small the intake tube is. And the bigger the tube, the harder it is to get this thing to run right. So everything would be better if we could convert to speed density, which I had a bit of I wouldn't call it an epiphany, but I had a bit of inspiration. The way that the car calculates its volumetric flow ratio is using an equation where the mass airflow sensor gives you your actual airflow based off the 0 to 5 volt reading. It then compares that to a theoretical airflow amount, and that's your volumetric flow ratio. So your theoretical airflow at 80 foot above sea level, which is where we are, is this equation right here. Now, I did this so that I can just punch in some numbers and see what I get, to see if we can just replace the MAF sensor with a map sensor. Will we still be able to use these tuning maps, but we will no longer be limited by the size of the MAF, because you can just run whatever map sensor you need to, and you just dial in these settings over here and these settings over here until you get everything to match. And based on the theory, this should work. And this will eliminate the need to play around with certain variables to get this thing to work. Now, it also will allow us to kind of bypass this torque delivery thing because it uses mass airflow as one of the inputs here. So if I run a fairly large pressure sensor as my 5 volt instead of MAF, the car is going to think it's making less torque than it actually is, in theory. So by having that, we now can, instead of shutting off torque control or electronic throttle control, we can now use it so that we can actually control the amount of torque the car makes. And in the Accutech side of things, this means we can actually use Accutech with the scale multipliers to actually make everything work. Now, Accutech allows you to scale your map sensor, which is used for boost control. UpRev does not allow you to scale your map sensor, so you're stuck with whatever map sensor you have. So you're limited to 27 pounds of boost, which is not enough for a 1.6 liter to make really any decent power. So, and when I say decent power, I mean like 450 plus. So the logic here is we're going to test this with UpRev first. I have an UpRev car here. The gentleman has agreed to let me do this experiment because it's just involving trimming back a couple wires and it can be reversed. And we're going to see if we can get the car to run and move using a speed density conversion that I've kind of figured out. If it moves and runs and moves nicely, I'm going to throw it on the dyno and we're going to start doing wide open throttle pulls on it to see what the car does. I don't want to take the thing out on the street and then have it break down on me. So I'm going to throw it on the dyno first and see if it can handle it. Now, if it can handle it, then we just have to tune everything that isn't wide open throttle. I also want to be able to see on the dyno where these volumetric flow ratio numbers land using the MAP sensor, because I need to use that to figure out what it's converting the MAP sensor reading into. Now, if this works, this also opens up the ability for us to run larger fuel injectors and larger fuel pumps on the direct injection system. Now, we do have a K fuel multiplier for changing injector size, which is fine, but direct injection, as we know, doesn't operate like a normal fuel injector. So once you go up in fuel pump and injector, you have to adjust a bit more than just this K fuel multiplier. Because remember that your fuel compensation map is literally a compensation percentage. So like this is 93% over a base of value. So this is just going to open up what kind of tuning we can do, and also open up the ability to put bigger injectors and fuel pumps in. I have a lead on a larger direct injection injector and a larger fuel pump. I want to make this abundantly clear though, port injection conversions are still where it's at. A standalone ECU is still where it's at if you want to make big power. I'm trying to find a way to do this that reduces the price to make bigger power reliably. That's the key word there, is reliably. So the next thing we're going to work on is figuring out a way to do flex fuel, which the software doesn't allow for that, but I have an idea as to how we can get around the software not allowing for flex fuel. Because the biggest thing with flex fuel is the car actually reads everything in lambda and then converts it to air fuel ratio for display. It actually is a lambda reading. So you can put E85 in the car and the fuel will technically adjust itself up to the maximum adjustment limits, which is only 20%. So you can't run too much ethanol. The issue comes with ignition timing, because ignition timing is where you gain your power with flex fuel. And there's no way to make the ignition timing increase as the ethanol increases. That's one of the big maps that's missing. And you also don't have a means of making your boost increased as ethanol increases. But again, I think I have a theory behind that, but we got to get speed density to work before we worry about any of that. So I'm going to take you guys along for how we're going to try to do this, and we're going to see if it works. If it works, cool. If it doesn't, then we'll see that it doesn't work. All right, so this is our test vehicle. This is Big Phil's all-wheel drive CVT Juke. Yes, we are going to do this on CVT just because this is the only up-rev car that I had available to me. So this car has a stage 2 turbo bay turbo on it, downpipe back exhaust, has one of those eBay intercoolers on it, LS converted alternator, Mac valve conversion, Turbo Smart diverter valve, and that's pretty much it, I think. Oh, and hidden catch can. So we use this car for testing a lot, which is why like the sheathing's all missing from over there. So on top of that, we're gonna need a couple other things. We're gonna need a MAP sensor. So this is a low dollar motorsport 0 to 100 PSI sensor, which sounds like a lot, but remember, subtract 15 PSI from that reading, and that's all the boost pressure, positive pressure you'll be able to read. We also need this to be fairly large. At low load and low RPM, the mass airflow sensor is still really sensitive, so the voltage moves around quite a bit. If we have this too small, we're gonna have too much movement. I'd rather reduce that movement down a little bit, which we can do using this, because we do need to simulate as close as we can to the mass airflow, and that, based off of data logs and stuff, I'm thinking this is about as close as we can get. And then we obviously need a way to get manifold pressure, which we have this vacuum tee, and then some hose. So what we're gonna do is we are gonna strip back this harness. We are going to tap into the power and ground, not cut, tap into. We're then gonna cut the signal wire and then run power, ground, and signal to the MAP sensor. mount the MAP sensor, just zip tie it somewhere for now. Run a vacuum T off of something, probably a diverter valve line, something that goes to the manifold that's a pretty short run, and that will be our manifold pressure reading. That's all we have to do under here to then deal with the software side of it, which the software side of it is going to be a pain. Now, I'm going to do some things a little ghetto. I don't have a nipple for this, but we're just going to clamp onto the threads because, again, we're not looking for something that's staying in the car. This is just to test it here today, and then we're going to put it back to stock so that Phil can keep driving this thing around every day. So let's see what happens, and we'll go from there. I almost forgot, we also need copious amounts of Coca-Cola. Copious amounts of it. So we have that tapped in. Doesn't look pretty, but it works. We have our 3-wire connector here. Low Dollar sells these pre-made harnesses for these sensors, and by God, is this amazing. So now it's just a matter of getting a vacuum source to the sensor. The question's going to come up, why can't we use the factory MAP sensor? And that would be because that's not going to see vacuum. This is as Nissan calls it, a boost sensor. Now it is a MAP sensor, it is a pressure sensor, it is a manifold absolute pressure sensor. It just isn't designed for these specific uses. On the V2 engine, there is an actual manifold pressure sensor, which the V2 is a whole nother thing. So that's why we're not using that. And also keep in mind, if this works, then as long as there is tuning software for it, should be able to do this to most of the MR engine family. Assuming UpRev has fixed the issues with their software related to the Cube and Versa, that would mean this would work on those. The B15 Sentras, which a lot of people build and boost those. Getting rid of the mass airflow sensor on that and not having to spend $3,000 on a standalone would be great. So we're going to tap in pressure for this, get that hooked up, and then see what the car does. All right, so this has the 2-to-1 catch can setup on it. So the PCV return port to the intake manifold was available, and it is evenly distributed between all 4. So we'll try that. So that's just clamped on there. We got it plugged in, we got it hooked up. So what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna hook up to the car and data log. I'm gonna try to start it without doing anything and see what it does and see what we get for voltage readings out of that. So let's give this a shot. We're gonna try to start it and see what it does. Wow, start it right up. MAF is reading. We're gonna see if our air-fuel ratios are right. It's actually idling perfect. We do have a check engine light on. Let's see what that's for. I'm assuming MAF voltage out of range because, you know, it's out of range. So let me do some inspecting and we'll see what we get. All right, so it was a mass airflow code P0102, which makes sense because this voltage is a lot lower than it normally read. But reading stuff over, our air-fuel ratio is fine. It's pulling a little bit of fuel. Again, I didn't expect this to be perfect right when we started up, but it pulled a little bit of fuel. We're gonna give it some revs and see what it does. It is in limp mode because of that code. All right, let's see if we can do something about that. We have that code just disabled just for testing. Let's fire it up. Oh yeah, that's not running great. That's what I was expecting it to do. It's trying to idle. Just need to keep we're running long enough for the wideband to start reading. Wideband is reading. You can see it's like leaning out. So I'm going to play with the tune a little bit and see if we can get it to idle. All right, we're idling real good. We got corrections fixed. So basically we're just scaling what the MAF should be. So we're essentially just tricking the car into thinking that it's got a much, much bigger MAF in it. But you see how low that voltage is now on the standard mass airflow sensor. You don't even use like below 0.4 volts. It just doesn't. But if we look at our volumetric flow ratio, we're only sitting, like we're sitting around where it should be from the factory. So the calculation is still coming out right. Now it does use the factory map sensor to come to these conclusions as well, but it's looking good so far. So it's going really, really rich right now. So it's also warming up, and the fuel adjustments for the increase in temperature are going to have to get fixed. So we're just going to go in here and just get it to line up. Now the car's fully warm, and we'll just go and we'll adjust the compensation values for the coolant temp later. So that's working. Now I went in here and I turned ETC off, but it's not off. I never flashed this. So the electronic throttle control is currently on and it's running. So we're going to give it a couple snaps and see what it does. Okay, so it revs totally normal. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to stop this data log. We're going to clear it. I'm going to start logging, and we're going to really rev it to get a little positive pressure in the manifold and see what it does. I'm wondering if I blew the tube off because it's running like shit now. Alright, let's pause that. I'm going to look at that, and I'm also going to check the tube under the hood because now it's running really, really off. All right, so been playing around with it a little bit, and it is cutting, like not cutting out, but like if I hold the throttle so that we're at like 2,000 RPM, I am not doing that. It's dropping the RPMs. Thinking that might have something to do with the ETC. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to clean off the engine bay, and I'm going to see if this thing will move. It's idling fine. Everything's moving around the way it should. It's just we're at the point where it's going to need tuning. So I'm going to see if it will move. If it does, cool. If it doesn't, then that answers our question. Because this is also important on the CVT cars, because the CVT uses excuse me, uses the engine load to calculate stuff for the CVT as well. So let's see what it does. All right, let's see if this thing will move. We're in reverse. We're running okay. Phil's like 15 feet taller than me, so his mirrors are all over the place. So we're moving. Test is going to be going forward, and I really don't want to break down the street, so we're just going to back up a little bit, and then I'm going to give it some throttle. Nope, didn't like that. Okay, we are still not reading air fuel ratio, so I'm going to start this back up once we get air fuel ratio. Reading air fuel ratio, we're in drive. I'm going to give it some throttle. Put it in, we'll leave it in drive. Let's see what we do. Okay, so So that worked pretty good. Air fuel ratio went a little on the rich side, but our enrichment tables are going to be off a little bit, so that's kind of to be expected. So let's try that again. Let's see what we get. Ooh, it does not like low load, but that's going to come down to just tuning. So let's try this again. Clear log. And drive. Oop, did not like that. Try that again. So now I'm going to look over that log and see what it was doing when it was sputtering and see if it's just a tuning issue. Alright, so here's where we're at. So because we're having to mess around to make the mass airflow line up pretty much with the way the MAP sensor is working, it's going to take some adjusting of this scale. You can see these numbers are all like crazy, but I have it so that I can go about half throttle. So you can see right here, 2.7 volts that last time. I gave it a quick whoop. And, 2,000 RPM. We got it up to, about 3,000 RPM here. And it's not breaking up. It's still running pretty lean. But again, it's just in like certain area. It needs tuning. So the concept itself works. So the next step is going to be to actually tune it. Now, we're going to have to play with our timing map because it's saying we're getting some knock on initial throttle. So we might need to play around with that a little bit. I'm also not entirely sure how much I trust that, considering there's like solid motor mounts in this thing. And it doesn't appear to be pulling any timing. So it works. We're at that point. It works. So I still have electronic throttle control on, wherever that setting is. So it's still electronic throttle control. I haven't touched any of the torque maps yet, and that'll just play with how much throttle it gives it, really. But it works. So the next step is we need to get this thing on the dyno and start putting real boost in it to raise that map sensor value and get it to go higher and higher and see how the car responds to that. And then we'll get a wastegate spring tune of like 7 PSI in this thing, and then we'll take it on the street and see what it does. But so far, this is working. It requires a lot of work to get it dialed in, but it is working. And it is cooperating. So one of the things we're also going to have to do is measure how much torque it thinks it's making, and we should see that torque a lot lower than it actually is. If the way that it calculates it is right. I think it uses the voltage and not the MAF percentage for that calculation. Even if it does, the way this should work is this voltage is just going to give us, our base fuel schedule further up. Once we hit on this one, let's call 7 PSI, that should only be about, 1.2 volts. We won't use the rest of it. So this we can set at whatever we want this to be. So we could basically make this so that it reads out to 81% of volumetric efficiency, volumetric flow ratio, but you're pumping that up to like 80%. And we're just not using the rest of it, just like you would in speed density. So it's just going to take some playing around with it, because obviously this is new. But it's so far it's working. It's just we gotta keep playing with it. And it is, I picked the hardest car to do this with, which is a CVT car, because the way it loads up is just weird. But it is loading up properly and it's running properly, so that's a good sign. Before I can get down on here, we got to get the Z off. Now, the gentleman that owns it just got back from a vacation, and I want him to see this do a rip on the dyno on ethanol. Obviously not a great day to go driving it because it's just going to have zero traction, but I at least wanted to see it do a full rip. And we're also going to do hood and bumper stuff. So as soon as this is gone, put that back on. It might not be today, it might be tomorrow, so we'll see.